Today, we begin a 4-week journey alongside Job as our first reading. I think most of us are aware of Job's story, even if we haven't ever sat down to read the actual biblical text. Job was blameless and upright. In other words, Job was as good a person as there ever was, doing right by God and by his fellow creatures. And then God tests Job to see whether he will continue to trust in God in the face of loss. God takes away Job's property, his children, his physical health, his livelihood, everything he holds dear. Job is deeply grieved, physically pained, and angry. His friends come to comfort him, offering explanations of why this might have happened, and he gets even more angry and distressed. Turning his pain inward on himself, he laments that he was ever born. As his friends continue to analyze his situation, his anger moves from inwardly focused to outward and upward. He blasts his friends for how unhelpful their explanations are, and then begins to question God, and question God, and question God. God eventually responds. God doesn't offer any real explanation of why God did what God did, but God does eventually restore Job's losses. Job's story is challenging to me, and I imagine to many of you. It presents a God who allows a guy who has done everything right to be tormented, simply to see just how faithful he will be. Here, it can be really helpful to understand a bit about the origins of the book of Job. There wasn't ever an actual Job who reported an actual detailed dialogue with God in which God revealed God's own hand in the systematic destruction of his life, the transcript of which was written down and will be heard by us this month. Rather, the book of Job is an amalgamation of a number of legends and stories circulating at the time of its writing about a generic man who suffers. But to say there wasn't an actual Job robs the poignancy and insights of Job's story so critical for us in this very week. And to say there wasn't an actual Job also isn't altogether accurate. Indeed, there wasn't a specific Job, Job Smith, born in 800 BCE, whose story we hear. But there have been myriad real Jobs across time. Folks whose suffering, often at the hands of powerful or power-hungry, has been profound and not remotely explained by any discernible cause-effect relationship. We honor some of them tomorrow in some municipalities on Indigenous Peoples' Day. We have sat with some others in these very pews as they have battled cancer, depression, anxiety, and addiction. We have heard the painful witness and lament of still others, survivors of sexual assault on our social media apps and in the newspapers this last year, and just last week, speaking out to our legislators. Profound suffering is indeed all around us, and if not yet, then at some point is our own experience. So what does Job's story offer us in the midst of all this suffering? On first pass, it can seem like nothing. The narrative setup of the story, that God and Satan collaborate to cause Job's suffering, can lead us to think that the book of Job is primarily about explaining why suffering happens, even to good people. But if we spend time in Job's story, we see that the cause of suffering is not what the book of Job intends to be about. If it were primarily about why suffering happens, God would have offered an explanation for why God tested Job. God would have offered some sort of goal for what God hoped Job might learn or develop. But God does not. The book of Job is really about the what and how of suffering, what it feels like, how it progresses, and how we engage our faith even in the midst of it. As scholar Amy Jill Levine has characterized the book of Job, it aims to describe the human condition of vulnerability. Indeed, when do we experience our vulnerability more than when we suffer from something we could not have predicted because we did absolutely nothing to warrant it? I wonder whether the sages who put the book of Job together began it the way they did, not to clearly and ultimately name God as the source of suffering, but rather to give us permission to blame God when there is no one else to blame, or when those who are to blame refuse to listen. Because so very often we need someone in power to acknowledge our lament, to simply say that they have heard us, in order to get to a place where we can do what we need to do to get through the pain. So what can the book of Job teach us about the how and what of suffering? A great deal, it turns out, I think. Let me walk you through 3 of the things I have learned or relearned this week as I have sat with Job's story. Thing 1. Loss and illness and wrenching suffering happen indiscriminately and unpredictably. The gift of the book of Job is that it bears witness to this. It allows us to hear this incredibly challenging truth echoed in the experience of others from across time and culture. A significant component of our spiritual work, especially as followers of Christ, is to sit with this reality, and sit with it not in our heads trying to make sense of it, because no sense can ultimately be made of it, really, but in our hearts, acknowledging its reality and mourning it. Job sits in silence with the reality of suffering in his life for an entire week, complete silence. To face the reality of human suffering, our loved ones, the suffering of all those we see but have never met, is to deepen our well of compassion and love, and in so doing, to deepen our willingness to advocate and to help. The second learning from the book of Job is the importance of listening. This lesson is both for all of us who seek to comfort and uphold those who are suffering, and to each of us when we are named as the source of suffering. Listening while those who suffer weep, listening while they rage, listening while they defend themselves and all their efforts to do good for the world. In the story of Job, his friends listen. And for 40-plus chapters, so does God, who the story, at least, names as the source of Job's suffering. Listening, however, is incredibly challenging, as we all know. Job's friends sit alongside him silently for the 7 days and nights that Job faces the reality of his loss and pain. It seems like that must be long enough. But Job's story makes clear that even that isn't long enough. After 7 days of silence, Job's friends begin to take turns trying to make him feel better, providing a series of platitudes and explanations for his suffering. But each only compounds it. Job's relationship with God and experience in the world tells him that his friends' explanations are inauthentic. They don't ring true to his experience. Job's pain is only deepened by his friends' posits that either Job must have done something to deserve this, or that Job's suffering is a sign that God actually loves him more than others, and so has deigned to take time away from the far more important tasks of the Almighty to steward Job by causing him wrenching grief and pain. As those who seek to uphold those who are suffering, or as those who have wrought pain. The book of Job cautions us against jumping in too soon with attempts to soothe or to deflect. Job's story implores us to listen to the laments of those who suffer far longer than is comfortable for us, and much more carefully. Thing 3, and perhaps most countercultural for St. Paul's, that the book of Job invites us into, is debate. Job's story argues, number 1, that it is okay, even righteous, to rail at and argue with God when we are suffering. And number 2, that an integral part of the spiritual life is in engaging in dialogue with each other, and sometimes heated debate about our beliefs regarding who God is and when and how God acts. Job argues with God, but also with his friends. Job and his friends go back and forth, debating what Job's experience might reveal about their God and their faith. Despite all this arguing with each other and with God, still, or perhaps because, God declares Job righteous at the end and restores all that he had lost. These are important teachings, especially at this time in our shared life, in which suffering is as present as ever and where authentic listening is scarce. Despite its challenging beginning, the book of Job is, for me, liberating. To quote the poetry of Reverend Anna Bladel, it blesses those of us who are mourning, who are raging, who feel numb, with an affirmation of our pain. And it challenges all of us to shine the holy light of compassion and care that resides within us. May it call us to acknowledgement and mourning. May it call us to sustained listening. May it call us to discussion and debate, and may it empower all of us, to collaborate in restoring to wholeness and life those we who suffer. Amen.